Uh, the book of Ruth is going to feel like a nice cup of cold milk after you've just eaten a super hot pepper. Isn't that what you do? You drink milk after a pepper? Boy, when we go through Joshua, all the killings and the war that we saw, and all through the exile while they were in the wilderness, the harshness that they endured for their rebellion, and then in Judges was kind of the climax. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes, and just about everybody in Judges was corrupt and immoral and upset God. And then all of a sudden we come to the book of Ruth, and we have three main characters in the book of Ruth. Three main characters are going to be Naomi, Ruth, and who else? Yes. These are our three main guys, and it is amazing how wonderful all of these people are. And we'll look at some of the background here. So we think that Samuel, who we think wrote Judges, we think Samuel also wrote Ruth. The book is a story. It's only 4 chapters long. And it's of the 1,200 words that are in the book of Ruth, over 600 of them are dialogue. And that's why the book of Ruth is so engaging. It's short, and it's mostly people talking to each other. The three main characters, Ruth speaks the least. Boaz and Naomi speak the most. And so if you were going to entitle the book based on the plot, who is it about? It would be based on Naomi. If you were going to judge the book based on the dialogue and who talks the most, it would be called the book of Boaz. And so the interest is the reader, for whatever reason, even though Ruth speaks the least in the whole book, the reader ends up having the biggest impression of Ruth. Another thing that's interesting, that's rather remarkable, is Ruth is a Moabite, and she's referred to as Ruth the Moabite through the whole book. And so it would be strange, unless it was God's providential act, that the Jewish people would have named the book after Ruth, since she was a Moabite, technically one of the enemies. How the Moabites come about, we'll look at that. The date, if you look, let's see. If you look at the first verse there in the first chapter of Ruth, says that in the days when the judges ruled. So this happened sometime during the book of Judges, when everything was upside down. So just some background of when this is happening then is, we'll remember Judges chapter 10 and verse 13. I think I might have put these at where it says date on your page there. Judges 10:13, what was happening? Judges 10:13, he says, "But you have forsaken me, and you have served other gods. Therefore I will no longer deliver you. Go out and cry to the gods that you've chosen, and let them deliver you in your time of distress." So God had kind of had it with the people when we read the book of Judges. Another aspect of where we're at in this comes from Moses' final sermon in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, that whole chapter is a blessing or a curse, depending on the covenant relationship of Israel. If you'll obey me, I'll give you the blessing. If you disobey, it will be the curse. And of course, they disobeyed. So the book of Ruth happens during the time that they disobeyed and they were living under the curse. You'll notice it says that there was a famine in the land. In the days of the judges ruled when there was a famine in the land. That famine was also brought about by God. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15, "If you don't obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all the curses that I have spoken of will come upon you. The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, fever, inflammation, fiery heat, drought, blight, and mildew. They'll pursue you until you perish. The heavens over your head shall be bronze, and the earth under you shall be iron, and the Lord will make the rain of your land powder." You're not going to get any rain. The heavens will not open up, so the ground will be dry. "From heaven dust shall come down until you are destroyed." That's Deuteronomy 28, 22 through 24. So that is the situation that we are under when these people in the book of Ruth are being exemplary examples in that period of time, okay? So there was a famine. The theme of the book, and I gave you all of these because I thought this was just, it moved me. It was beautiful about the book. The theme of chesed. Chesed is a Hebrew word, and I'll just give you the quotes that Daniel Block gives us in his commentary of Ruth. And it's just amazing. This word chesed, a Hebrew word that wraps up in itself an entire cluster of concepts. It's all the positive attributes of God: love, mercy, grace, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness. So all those words are somehow wrapped up in the single Hebrew word chesed. Like the fruits of the Spirit, I guess. Look at that. Yeah. Yeah, good one, Nikki. The qualities, chesed, another definition, the qualities that move a person to act for the benefit of others without any respect to the advantage that it might bring to the person who expresses it. Completely selfless acts of kindness. Interesting that the direct object of the word is usually an action, to do, to act, or to demonstrate. So that reflects the quality, that reflects the fact that the quality of chesed is expressed fundamentally in actions rather than words or emotions. And then my own little comment and reading all that, I thought chesed was a better definition for the word love. Because today you can love Dairy Queen or carrot cake, but you can't chesed carrot cake, right? I like that word chesed. All of the qualities of God. And so we see acts of chesed in our three main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. The theology of the book, what's the point? It highlights the actions of both Ruth and Boaz as models of chesed for the readers to emulate or for the readers to copy. It also demonstrates God's absolute control over the affairs of the world and his providential involvement in the lives of individuals. The book of Ruth is interesting because throughout all the other books, we've been told God did this, God said this, God commanded this. All throughout the book of Ruth, you don't get that. Throughout the book of Ruth, you don't get God giving somebody orders. You just get people that are behaving with this chesed. And it's miraculous that even though they're in a horrible, horrible time with the rest of Israel, they are acting godly and good, and so things seem to work out. It's what we call providence. So that's an interesting aspect of the book. God's providential hand in establishing the kingdom of David. At the end of the book, that's going to be an important theme, King David. And I also noted that Ruth is the second non-Israelite. Remember we said Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth will be the second non-Israelite to become a daughter of Israel. And we talked about who is the true Israel. I tend to bring that up because we're in Revelation right now. Who is the true Israel? And remember Paul in Romans, I think about 9, said it is not the person that is circumcised outwardly that is the true Israel. It's the person who has a circumcised heart that is the true Israel. So there's a difference in Scripture from the nation of Israel to who is really a true Israelite. The true Israelite is anyone who will circumcise their heart and obey God, obey Jehovah. And so we saw that way back with, do you remember the other lady back in the Old Testament that was supposed to be killed and annihilated, a Canaanite? And when they went in and they knocked down the walls of Jericho, they saved her and her family? Rahab. Rahab is saved, and she is brought on to become a daughter of Israel. And at the same time, I forget the guy's name, but there was an Israelite from Judah that went out to fight a war and stole some things he wasn't supposed to steal. And so God brought death on them. So somebody that was physically Israel was excluded from Israel. Somebody who was excluded from Israel later became part of Israel. So the first one was Rahab. The next one is Ruth, the Moabite here. So I broke it into 3 sections, and I kept it kind of simple. It's only 4 chapters. The first section, I think appropriately, is death and emptiness. The middle section is gleaning the grain. Kind of kept it simple. And then the last section is triumph. It is life and fullness. So chapter 1, death and emptiness. As our text said here, let's go ahead and read 1 through 18 here. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem is where all this stuff is going down. Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, him and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, and Ephrathite was the Canaanite name for Bethlehem. So Ephrathite and Bethlehem are the same thing. People from Bethlehem were called Ephrathites. They went into the country of Moab. So they left their own country, went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. She was left with her 2 sons. These 2 sons took Moabite wives. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Not good in the eyes of God. He specifically told Israel, do not marry the Moabites or the Amorites. And we'll look up those verses so we will remind us. So now, this is going to be interesting about Ruth is you would think that they did wrong here, but there is a whole bunch of twists and turns in the book of Ruth that are interesting. So they took Moabite wives, which God had commanded them not to do. The name of one of the wives was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived in Moab about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, which were the 2 sons, so that the woman, which is Naomi, was left without 2 sons and without her husband. So in those early days, how was a woman going to survive without any men? She's going to be hungry. Yeah, not a good situation. Her husband and her sons are gone. That's right. Bad situation. One of the things that the text doesn't tell us, guys, we know later in the story that Naomi and Ruth, a kinsman redeemer comes. And I'm going to go into detail about what that is. But this redeemer was able to buy back their land. So what we don't get here is when her husband and Naomi and the 2 sons leave Bethlehem, most likely they were so broke that the first thing they did was sell off their land in order to be able to survive. And when that ran out, they moved away. And that's why later on, they have to try to buy back their own land. Okay, we'll talk more about that. So she loses her house. They've sold their land. She loses her husband. She loses her 2 sons, and she's in a foreign country. Not a good situation for Naomi. Let's see. True Israel. Okay. Over a 10-year period of time, they're away from home. Who were the Moabites? According to Genesis 19 and 36, about the time when Lot, remember Lot leaves Sodom and Gomorrah because it was so sinful? And when Lot leaves Sodom and Gomorrah, this is Genesis 19:36 and on. When Lot leaves Sodom and Gomorrah, who looks back and turns into a pillar of salt? Yeah, Lot's wife looks back. She turns into salt. So now, who's left in Lot's family? 2 daughters. Lot and his 2 daughters. And so they move away. Well, his 2 daughters get to thinking, and they're afraid that they are not going to be able to procreate because apparently there are no men wherever they have moved to. So do you remember what they do? Yeah. They get their dad drunk, and they each conceive a child from Lot. Okay, so incest. And what comes out of that is one boy whose name is Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites, and another boy named, oh shucks, I didn't get the name of the second. Maybe it was Ammon, because it's the Moabites and the Ammonites. Was it? Ben-Ami. Thank you. Good. So here, the Moabites and Ammonites are as a result of incest with the daughters, and there's another law that God had forbid that as well, if you remember when we read Leviticus. Okay, so that is how the tribe began. We run into Moab quite a bit throughout the wilderness wanderings. If you want to go to Numbers 25, this is where we run into Balak. Balak, if you remember, when Israel came through, Balak was up on a hill. And he had seen Israel conquering the Ammonites, and now he's afraid that they're going to come in and conquer the Moabites. And so do you remember another character named Balak and Balaam? Balaam, some kind of a prophet. And first he asked him to curse Israel. And when Balaam went to pray to the God of Israel, which is interesting that a false prophet could do that, and God would communicate with him. And God told him, nope, I'm not going to let you put a curse on Israel, but I want you to go bless Israel. So that's the first thing that happens. It was something strange as the story goes on. Since he can't curse Israel, he figures out another way in the back door. And what was the second way they tried to ruin Israel? Sent out the women. So they sent Moabite women into the Israel camp. And the Moabite women introduced the men to sexual immorality, and they got them to eat foods sacrificed to idols, and they got Israel to worship Baal. So, Moabite women, not a good wife there. The next time we see the Moabites is Ehud. Ehud, one of the judges, remember he was a left-handed guy, and at the time Elgon was the king of Moab. And what's the famous story of this left-handed guy that goes and kills Elgon? The hint is he lost his sword. And he couldn't get it back out. Yeah. Elgon was such a big man that when Ehud, the left-handed guy, stabbed him, his sword went all the way through the king, and he couldn't pull it back out. So, Moabite king there. Deuteronomy 23, if you want to look at that. God talks about the Moabites and the Ammonites. Deuteronomy 23, 2 through 4. 23, 2 through 4. So if we start in verse 2 there, no one born of a forbidden union may enter the assembly of the Lord. And those rules for who you could marry were in Leviticus. Even unto the 10th generation, none of the descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Because they did not meet you with bread and water. Does anybody remember our new word that has to do with the kindness of God? Chesed. Chesed. Big deal to God. So you can't mix with the Moabites or the Ammonites because they refused to practice chesed when you were journeying through the wilderness. They refused to bring you water. They refused to bring you bread when you came out of Egypt. And because they hired against you Balaam, the false prophet, son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. So Moabites were bad news. Solomon married Moabite women. And from 1 Kings 11, 1 through 8, the Moabite women led Solomon to worship Baal and commit idolatry. When Nehemiah was rebuilding the Jerusalem walls, Nehemiah 13, the first thing that he did was to bring Israel. Nehemiah 13, verse 1, the first thing Nehemiah did to bring Israel back to God. Since, do you remember, they started rebuilding Israel years before under Wasn't it Cyrus that let them go back? They started to rebuild, and then they quit rebuilding, and they started building their own houses instead. Right? And then God says, how come you live in fine paneled houses with wood floors, and God has no place to live? So he gets upset with them. So Nehemiah, the first thing he does to get everybody back to where they're supposed to be is, what is the first thing good people do to get people back to God? We already looked at Josiah did it. Back to Scripture. Yeah, he breaks out the book of Moses. When people are straying from God, a good leader breaks out the Scriptures. Starts with that. Josiah did that, and now here Nehemiah does it. So Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of all the people, and it was found written that no Ammonite or no Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread, but they hired Balaam instead. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all of those people that were of foreign descent. Just as a side note, you guys, can you tell how when things are really, really ugly, it's tough to be the right kind of person? Some people do it. I had a discussion with someone one time, and the question was, what's the right thing to do in this situation? But usually, they're asking that question after somebody has repeatedly messed up, and now things are so messed up for this person. Now they want to know, what's the right thing to do? And the response was, well, there is no right thing to do now because you're so far messed up, all you can do is the lesser of two evils, right? The right thing is don't ever break one of God's commandments. That would be the right thing to do. But when somebody has chained their life and a chain of wrongdoings, there comes a point that the right thing is too late. Now you just got to do whatever you can do to dig yourself out of the hole you dug yourself into. Okay, so Naomi's sons die. She suffers the loss of her husband and then her boys. And we see Ruth practicing Hesed. If we go back to the book of Ruth in chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1 and verse 16. Naomi's going to go back home to Bethlehem, and she tells the two daughters that since her sons are dead, she tells them to go home to their homes. And Ruth insists. In verse 16, Ruth said, "Don't urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and my God and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more, if anything but death parts me from you." Beautiful picture of Chesed. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Ruth was committed to Naomi's well-being. So they returned back to Bethlehem together. Naomi is feeling the pain. If we jump down to chapter 1 and verse 19, we'll see what she says here. As they returned to Bethlehem, it says, "So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them." So they've been gone for how long? 10 years. And Naomi comes back without her husband, without her sons, and with one girl. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me? The Almighty has brought calamity upon me." A couple of things there, guys. She says, don't call me Naomi, because Naomi means pleasant. Naomi means pleasant and joyful. And she said, I'm not that anymore. I'm not that anymore. We had to sell our property. I lost my husband. I lost my 2 sons. I spent 10 years away from home. And now I'm returning back with nothing. I'm not pleasant and I'm not joyful. She said, call me Mada, because Mada means bitter, and that's what I am. Couple things there. The definitions, why she asked them to call her a different name, is one thing. The second thing is you can't help but in some way relate that life, I mean, all of us have probably at some point felt it, but life is not necessarily all, what do we say? Something in roses. Bed of roses. There you go. Life is not always, peaches and cream. Good. Naomi had a hard time, difficult time, and she was hurt by it. I wanted to give you another reference. Turn to Genesis 47. Genesis 47 in chapter 7. In Genesis 47, Joseph has been sold into slavery, and he makes his way down to Egypt. And in Egypt, he happens to interpret some dreams, and so he works his way up. And remember, he's falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, so he goes back to jail. Somehow he works his way up, and he becomes the right-hand man for the Pharaoh in Egypt. He's allowed to bring his family back from, I think they were in Samaria. I think they were in Samaria. I have to double check that, guys.
They are come out of the land of Canaan.
Oh, okay. But Canaan is... Okay. No, they have to be in Egypt.
They are in the land of Goshen.
Oh, Goshen. They came out of Canaan. They're in the land of Goshen. There you go.
Egypt, and it takes them 500 years to get back.
That's exactly right, Ron. Okay, so they're in Goshen, and Pharaoh wants to meet Joseph's dad and brothers. And so that's where we're picking up the story here. Genesis 47 and verse 7. So Joseph brought his father Jacob. Jacob is Israel, right? The father of all Israel. He had been cheated when it came to Leah and Rachel. So he's been through some tough times. He said to his father Jacob, presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. What? Presented him before Pharaoh, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. How many years have you lived? Pharaoh asked Jacob. My pilgrimage has lasted 130 years, Jacob replied. My years have been few and what? Yeah. That's how he reflected on his life. I've lived few years, and it's been hard. It's been difficult. One was evil. Wow. It's been hard and it's been difficult. I find a little bit of comfort in that, guys, not because that's what we prefer, but all of us have been through times, and even David said that life, I can't quote it for you, but life has been like riding in a saddle for too long. David said that. So there are times where life is bittersweet. But, okay, so Jacob found the same thing. So poor Naomi here is not real pleased. God's going to turn this around for her. We go to the second part, gleaning grain. Chapters 2 through 3 is this section. Chapters 2 through 3. Chapter 2, Naomi is sowing chesed. Ruth is sowing chesed towards Naomi. Chesed is kindness, generosity, love. She's dumping this into Naomi. She goes out to glean grain so that they'll have something to eat. Okay? Chesed towards Naomi. Then, in chapter 2, verses 8 through 23, Boaz sows chesed towards Ruth. Ruth is now going to benefit from all this kindness that she's been showing Naomi. If we read chapter 2 and verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another man's field or leave this one. Stay close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men to leave you alone? So he's protecting Ruth. If she was to be walking around different fields trying to get a little bit of grain, apparently these were bad enough times. Well, it was the times of the judges. People were behaving badly. Remember the story of the priest that had the concubine, and he went in to spend the night at the guy's house, and they took his concubine and ravaged her and brought her back dead. So Ruth doesn't really want to be out walking around at this time. He asked her, when you're really thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face. She bowed down to the ground, and she said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land. You came to a people that you did not know. The Lord repay you for what you have done, full reward given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So Boaz is nice to her. I wanted you guys to note something. There's something rather prophetic here. Jump down to verse 14. Boaz is going to show Ruth a certain kind of kindness. Now, there was a tradition amongst the Israelites back in these days that when you had a feast at your home, there was the place of honor that was right next to the homeowner. So there was a place of honor, but there was another way to show honor as well. You would take someone a choice morsel, a piece of bread, a piece of meat. You would take this individual a choice morsel, and then you'd walk over and you'd let them dip their morsel in your cup of wine. A little weird. I don't know if it's sanitary, but that was the custom.
It wouldn't meet current code.
I don't think OSHA would go for that. So there was this act of kindness, or what did I say? The seat next to the guy was a seat of honor. It was a way of honoring a person. Okay? So in verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here, eat some bread, and dip your morsel into the wine. So she sat beside the reapers. She passed, and they passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. She had some left over. If you like to write in your Bibles, guys, I would circle that verse. I would circle verse 14 right there. Circle verse 14, and right next to that, write John 13:26. You want to cross-reference this with a situation in the New Testament. John 13:26 matches Ruth chapter 2 and verse 14. Can anybody remember what happens in John 13, just off the top of your head? What did we say about the number 13? This was for the John's Gospel students. That was before, yeah. Okay, some landmarks in John's Gospel. John's Gospel, what is usually associated with the number 13 in general? Bad luck. So I use that to remember that in John 13, Jesus was in the Last Supper, and he told Judas, what you're about to do, go do it quickly, and Judas leaves the room. So that's chapter 13. The next landmark is chapter 17, which is Jesus' farewell prayer. So he prays for himself, for his disciples, and for the rest of the world. So in 13, does anybody remember something that is similar to what happened with Boaz and Ruth? You might look it up. 13 and 20. That's right. That's right. Let's turn and read that. John 13:26. John 13:26. You can start in 13 and verse 25. They're at the Last Supper. Jesus had just said that somebody's going to betray him. And so John, the disciple Jesus loved, the disciple leaned back against Jesus and said, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he whom I will give this morsel of bread after I have dipped it. So when he dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. We normally don't connect what's happening there, but Jesus had given Judas the space right next to him at the Last Supper. So that was the place of honor. Now Jesus is doing for Judas the same thing Boaz did for Ruth. He's honoring him by dipping a morsel and giving it to him. We always look at that as some kind of sign of how Judas was going to betray Jesus. But what this section of Scripture makes clear is that Jesus loved all of his disciples, even up to the very end, even the one that betrayed him. Gave him the place of honor next to him, gave him the morsel, and honored him that way. And so Jesus had done everything he could do for Judas. There's quite a story in that. So that was an act of honor. And despite it being the act of honor, Judas took the morsel, went out, and betrayed Jesus. There's some big significance to all that. Okay, back to Ruth. Ruth chapter 2. Chapter 3. Now we see chesed being practiced towards Boaz. Does anybody basically remember the story? What does Ruth do to honor Boaz? Naomi actually sends her in to lay by his feet, keep his feet warm while he's fast asleep out in the fields. So Ruth goes and does that. Boaz wakes up, and Ruth has the wherewithal to ask him to, I don't know if she said basically marry her, but to redeem her and Naomi. So if we pick it up in verse 12, the conversation, we'll pick it up in chapter 3 and verse 12. Boaz says, I know that it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer that is nearer than I. So remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. So this is Boaz and Ruth. Question is, what's a redeemer? What's a redeemer? We have to understand the nature of the division of the land after Joshua. The end of Joshua, all the land is divided up. And then each tribe goes and inherits their own particular piece of land. Earlier in Leviticus, we find out something about the land. Let's look at Leviticus 25:23. Leviticus 25:23. God gives them the rules about the land, and part of the rules about the piece of land that your tribe was given is that even though it was given to you, God says, it belongs to me. You guys are just sojourners. You're kind of like visitors. And you're hanging out on my piece of property. Therefore, you don't get to sell it. You don't get to trade it. You don't get to lose it because it's mine, not yours. And each of the people were supposed to keep whatever little piece of land that they had garnished. They were supposed to keep that land forever. So that's where we pick up in Leviticus 25. The land must not be sold permanently because it is mine, and you are foreigners and sojourners with me. So the price of a piece of property that you possessed, you must provide the redemption for that land. This is the idea of redeeming. So here's what would happen. If you remember, there was something every 7 sets of 7 years. Every 50th year, what was that?
Jubilee.
There was a jubilee.
Give it back.
And what happens with the land on the jubilee?
Go back to the original owner.
It always goes back to the original owner. This was God's way of not allowing people to lose their property in a time of bankruptcy or debt or whatever. You couldn't lose your property. So what you could do, if you got into debt and you got hard up, you could sell off your land. But all you were doing was selling a lease. So if you had already been on the land, let's say 10 years, how many years till the Jubilee? 40. So you could sell your land, basically rent out your land to somebody for 40 years. And they would pay you money based on what's 40 years worth to me. If you had already been living on the land for 40 years, how long till the Jubilee? 10. So you could sell your land if you got in trouble, but it was only worth 10 years rent. You see how that worked? So at the end of whatever period of time, if you had already been on it for 49 years, you were only going to get 1 year's worth of pay out of your land. So this person could rent your land for 1 year. The 50th year, you got it back. Okay? So Naomi and her husband, being in tough times, probably sold off their portion of land. And now they're coming back, and whatever period of time remains until Jubilee, they're asking Boaz to pay for that chunk of time so that they can get the land back, and Naomi and Ruth can go live there with him. So that's the idea of redeeming the land. In this case, it had to be bought by an Ephrathite. It had to be bought by an Ephrathite because Naomi's husband, I forget his name, Eliakim, I don't remember his name. Elimelech, good job, guys. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, chapter 1, verse 1, was a Ephrathite. What's an Ephrathite? Bethlehem. There you go. Ephrathite and Bethlehem was the same thing. So these were people from Bethlehem. So a fellow Ephrathite had to be the one to redeem the land because it had to stay within the family. So Boaz, and I forget his relationship to Naomi's husband. But anyway, because he was in the family, he could redeem the land. But he said that there is somebody else that is closer than I am. And I think what that meant is somebody else that was younger than him. The younger person got the chance to redeem the land. So, let's see. Ephrathites.
The redemption price had something with it.
Yeah, the land and the women. There you go. Yeah. I had a couple references on the Ephrathites. Just a side thing. Genesis 35:19. When Rachel died, giving birth to Benjamin, Jacob buried her on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. Ephrathah was the Canaanite name for Bethlehem. Another Ephrathite was Jesse. Jesse became the father of King David, who was also an Ephrathite because he was from Bethlehem in Judah. Okay, and then the third part here, back to life and fullness, chapter 4. Redeeming Amalek's property. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, Boaz has a meeting with the town elders, and he lets them know what his plan is, and he offers the land to the nearest redeemer, the younger redeemer, first. And he says, great, love it, want the land, I'll buy it. And he says, okay.
What comes with it?
That's right. If you buy the land to redeem the land, you also get his women, because his women have to procreate and continue the chain. So you get a widow. Actually, you get two widows. You get two widows, Naomi and Ruth. And the guy says, yay or nay? No way. I got enough problems of my own. Huh?
Show on television, yay or nay or whatever.
Yeah. So he says no, and that means Boaz gets to reclaim it, and Boaz does so gladly. Chapter 4, 13 through 17. Boaz accepts it, and he gets Naomi and Ruth, the Moabite woman, as part of the deal. Here's something that I thought was interesting. When the one guy finds out that a foreign woman, a Moabite, is included in the deal, and he doesn't want to do it, he might have even been paying attention to God's laws. Don't marry with these people. Don't have anything to do with the Moabites or the Ammonites. And then when Nehemiah, in the rebuilding of the temple, when he breaks out the book of Deuteronomy and reads it to Israel, they all got rid of any of the foreign women that were in Israel. So this guy might have been following the rules. There's a hidden little gem here. I wonder if Boaz was able to accept Ruth, the foreigner, because Boaz himself was a black sheep. Boaz himself had to live with a tainted reputation. Does anybody remember what that was?
Wasn't he the one that was the son of Lot or something?
Salomon, a guy named Salomon, married Rahab the prostitute. A guy named Salomon, an Israelite, married Rahab the prostitute, and they had a son, and that son was Boaz. So Boaz's mom was Rahab the prostitute, the Canaanite. What do you think it was like growing up with that reputation? So it's not
When kids were out of wedlock, they used to call him.
Did pretty good. He's a rich farmer.
He's a rich farmer. Yeah, it worked out okay. So I can't help but think that Boaz, somebody said that you have to know hurt in order to have compassion for someone else's hurt. And so part of me feels like Boaz knows what it's like to be slandered or tainted. And the fact that Ruth was from a foreign land, he probably could relate to that. But she was a good woman. There's another place, I didn't write it down for you guys, but Boaz said something about Ruth, that she was a woman of noble character. I think that was when she laid down by his feet. He calls her a woman of noble character. Does anybody remember a scripture that talks about a woman of noble character? It's hard to find. Yeah. Is it the wife of noble character, Proverbs 31? Who can find her? I think there's a quote. Yeah, I think there's a quote there. That's her. Goes out and buys land, toils all day long, sees that her servants are up before the sun. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. And then we end the story. And this is something we want to look at. Chapter 4, verse 18. Chapter 4 and verse 18. I would draw a little circle around verse 21 and 22. So Ruth chapter 4, circle 21 and 22. And you're going to want to cross-reference that with Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Matthew 1, verse 5. So first let's read Ruth, and let's see what the difference is. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 21. Salmon fathered Boaz, and then Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered who? King David. King David. Okay, quite a neat lineage there. Let's go to Matthew 1:5, and it's the exact same genealogy, except Matthew chooses to add a little bit more information. So try to pick out what Matthew includes that we don't see in Ruth's genealogy there. So Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. He includes her. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. So, in the most tumultuous, upside-down, random, disobedient time of the judges, God still uses people to sovereignly bring about his anointed king, King David. Even if it meant he had to use a prostitute from a foreign land and a Moabite woman who he specifically told Israel, don't marry these women. There's something in all of that confusion and randomness that David ends up coming out of that, which is going to be God's anointed. And I don't know what you make of that, but to me it's just like, man, when things get down and dirty and upside down and backwards, God can still make good stuff happen, irregardless of who he has to use. Because remember how we studied the judges? Out of those 12 judges, do you remember only 1 or 2 of them were decent people? One of the judges sacrificed his daughter to God. What was the strong man? Samson, womanizer. All these guys are bad people. God was still able to use bad people to accomplish his goal. That's an amazing story here. That's it for Ruth, you guys. I did want to throw out one other. You notice on your papers there I put the prophecy of Micah 5. A Savior will come out of Ephraim. Again, in all this turmoil, another prophecy is going to be fulfilled. If we look at Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, where does all of our story take place at? Bethlehem. And the people from Bethlehem are called what? Ephrathites. So Bethlehem and Ephrathites. Okay, all this little story. Look at the prophecy of Micah chapter 5, right there in verse 2. But out of you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from the Ancient of Days.
When you have a famous ball player who comes out of a particular town, they put up a sign out there.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, so Bethlehem was called the city of David? Yeah, I think it was, the city of David. So there is just so much of God's, and you know, the story doesn't say God did this, God did that, God told them this, God forced. You don't really hear or see of God in the book. And yet when you finish the book, there's this overwhelming sense of God's sovereignty, God's providence, God making things happen, even in the most impossible of circumstances. And that is the book of Ruth.